6:30.
And we went live just as I was taking my my sip of tea. But hello, everyone. Hello, RISE community. Hello, Mzansi. Thank you so much once again for joining us this week for Fireside Chats. For those of you who are new on this platform, this is an experience that we created at RISE Mzansi to get to know our leaders. At RISE, we believe in accessible leadership. And so we also want to get to know the people who are leading us in the organization outside of the political and the organizing work that they do every day. And so today I am incredibly excited to be having a conversation with Prof. Nick Binedell. He is, I don't want to say the oldest, I'm going to say the most mature person, the most experienced person that we've had on Fireside Chats. So I'm really looking forward to just unpacking who he is, his journey, his inspiration, and why he's gotten into the very difficult but also fulfilling work of doing politics. Before we get into it, I just have an announcement to make, and that is that our video on this week's Citizens Assembly will not be available straight after tonight's Fireside Chat, but it will be made available throughout the week. So if you didn't know, RISE Mzansi facilitates what we call Citizens Assemblies every week, where we invite a panel of experts, we invite our network, we invite the community to discuss our policy proposals on a variety of issues in the spirit of championing public participation. This week, we looked at RISE Mzansi's proposed interventions to end hunger in South Africa. We held our Citizens Assembly in Lenasia at the Gandhi Hall. And so you'll be able to draw into that conversation sometime this week. But more importantly, I think this week, we will be having our next Citizens Assembly, which will look at jobs. That's happening on the 1st of May. So do watch out on our social media platforms for more information. But now that all of the admin is out the way, let's get into our conversation with Prof. Nick. So I like to just allow the guests to introduce themselves. So we know Prof. Nick Binedell, and we know the Wikipedia version, right? So we know that you are an experienced academic, someone who has a lot of experience within South Africa's academic sector, and that you are, of course, the founder of the Gordon Institute of Business Science. But outside of that, who is Prof. Nick Binedell? Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And I think let us into some of the things that we may not know about your journey thus far.
Thanks so much, Dimpho. It's great to be with everybody. Yeah, you've asked an interesting question. Who am I? I've spent most of my professional life, as you hinted at, in the education arena, in the business school world. I was head of the Wits Business School, and then was given the opportunity to start a new school from scratch, which we opened in 2000, known as Gibbs. Yeah, I was born in Zim, but I had a very unusual childhood, like many South Africans, actually. I lived in 6 countries by the time I was 10. So
Sure.
Many South Africans came back after 94. Well, I didn't. I came back much earlier, but I was born in Zim. I lived in Germany and England and Yemen, and then Kenya. So I spoke Swahili, Arabic, and German as a little boy. Sadly, I lost them all. And I've been I grew up in Cape Town, and then went to university, and after that went to Jozi to work, which I did for 40 years before coming home about 5 years ago back to Cape Town. So I was first in business. I was an executive, a general manager of a company at quite a young age, and I did my doctorate in the USA. And I came back to South Africa in the time that many, I'm sure, who are listening or watching wouldn't have the kind of memories I do. In 1986, the second state of emergency, and I joined the UDF, and I became the chairman of Five Freedoms Forum, and we were activists in the process of democratizing South Africa. So I come from quite a long political interest, but this is the first time I've been formally involved in the structure of a party.
Mm. And I want us to go into that a little bit, because it's not every day you get to be in conversation with someone who was at the forefront of a movement that was as impactful and I think as groundbreaking as the United Democratic Front in South Africa. You mentioned a state of emergency. I know that we use that term a lot these days just because of the state of affairs in our country, and we like talking about how we're in a state of crisis and we should declare this a state of emergency. But very few of us have actually lived through a state of emergency. And so I want you to just paint a picture for us of what was it like to live in that time, what was happening in the country during that time, the relations between white and Black people during that era, and how difficult it must have been to do the work of the UDF.
Well, many of my colleagues were braver than me. I was a leader, but I wouldn't say I was in the top leadership of the UDF. But I met them all and knew them all. People whose names are in the history books were friends, and some of them still are, who really led the struggle, because the UDF was an internal organization to resist apartheid. So our motto was, apartheid divides, the UDF unites. And we were 700 organizations. I mean, it was an extraordinary time for civil society, which got together. Church groups, women's groups, youth groups, all got together and said enough's enough. And it was part of the buildup of South Africa's isolation then, and the struggle against apartheid, and played a very big role in the mass democratic movement to bring South Africa to a constitutional democracy, which we are celebrating our 30 years of freedom. It was a scary time. I had some friends who were killed. I had many who were arrested. I was never threatened particularly, but many of my activist friends were. There were quite a few white people in the UDF who were very brave in the underground or working in civil society, who really struggled. I remember, for example, in 1986, when the second state of emergency was declared, which basically meant that the country was shut down. And I remember going to the city hall in Johannesburg, where, as we were about 1,000 people, and as we were about to start, a policeman got onto the stage and said that we've been told there's a bomb in the building and you should all leave. And everybody just laughed and said, go away, because we knew it was just a scare tactic. It's very hard, you know, you've said the words yourself. It's so hard to describe how brutal South Africa was. I grew up as a young boy in Kenya and then came to South Africa, and I lived in a working class Afrikaans community, and the racism was so rife. It was a shock to me. Kenya was much more liberal, and coming here was a very big shock to me. Later, as I got active when I came back in 86, because I went to America for 4 years to study, and there I really learned about South African history, actually. What also people don't realize is everything was banned. So you couldn't read about our history properly. You couldn't read about the ANC. You couldn't, Sechaba, if you had Sechaba, which was an ANC publication, you immediately arrested and given a sentence. So it was a very, very difficult time. I'll just give you one image. So my colleagues and I used to meet, and we met in, I just have one memory of this, in Wynberg, in Joburg. And what we would do is we'd gather the traffic lights, and then we'd see if we were being followed. And if we weren't being followed, then we would then meet in a coffee shop. But we had a protocol, which is if the police arrived, then we had to tear off a slip. We had our notes on little pads, and we had to tear them off and chew them so they couldn't get the names. I mean, it was a crazy, crazy time. Every weekend were funerals of comrades who'd been killed in that struggle. And I think about that a lot. I mean, the UDF was affiliated with the ANC, and I was too. And then I became extremely disillusioned in the Zuma years. And I went into civil society, actually, the last few years. And then about a few years ago, I met Songezo, who I knew a little bit, and decided that actually politics is the central question in this country. If we can't get our politics right, we can't get anything else right.
Sure. And we will definitely circle back to that. Politics is the central question in our country, and that's what we need to get right first. But on the back of what you have just described and the picture that you've kind of painted, I mean, having to tear off your slip and chew it, and constantly looking over your shoulder and being on the lookouts because you might be arrested for choosing to organize against apartheid. Yesterday, we did celebrate Freedom Day in South Africa. Not celebrate, commemorate, pardon me, Freedom Day in South Africa, which marks 30 years since South Africa's first democratic election. And you talk about having been in business and then having also gone through academia. And I just want you to talk us through some of the transformation that you've seen in the space. I do understand that while the space has been significantly transformed, it is not where it needs to be. And so maybe talk us through how those spaces changed following 1994, both business and academia.
As so many people say, Dimpho, there was this 10 years that were almost unbelievable. I mean, I can recall the minute I heard on television that ANC was unbanned, and I can recall the 94 election, as all people of my age can. And then there was a euphoria, a sort of Disney world of possibilities, led by the leaders of the struggle, who came back triumphantly and linked up with internal comrades from Robben Island or just from the UDF and other organizations, COSATU. And there was this 10 years or so in which it's almost as though anything was possible, that we would reconcile, that we would grow the economy, that we would reinstate dignity to all South Africans, which we did. You know, as much as I'm very critical of this administration, one must acknowledge what the ANC's contribution had been. The ANC really was at the forefront of the struggle for liberation, and one must credit it for its achievements. But on the other hand, we need new leaders, which is what RISE stands for. Maybe we'll come back to that. But it's very hard to describe those days. And in a way, I'm not sure it's productive. Those were those days. These are these days. And I'm much more interested in engaging with South Africans about what lies ahead. What I have learned, for what it's worth, is that history hangs around in the room. And that although we like to imagine as a younger generation, and I'm not in the younger generation, but although the younger generation likes to imagine and always does that it can do almost anything, the truth is we're in the grip of history in many ways. And much of South Africa, if you just look spatially at South Africa, where people live, the poor travel the furthest to work and the rich are closest to work. The overwhelming majority of unemployed people are Black South Africans, and that's just a legacy. And Bantu education's consequence we're still dealing with. And I hope we get to talk about education tonight, because I've spent my whole professional life in the world of education. And we live in a knowledge economy where it's not your minerals, it's your mind that matters. I travel a lot around the world, and I've been traveling to Southeast Asia the last 18 months. I've spent 14 weeks going to 6 different countries to see why they're being successful. And it's two things. One is education, and the other is they trust and respect each other. Those are the two fundamental things. It's not the government, it's not the law, it's they trust and respect each other, and they work together, So that's left a huge impact on me. And coming from the 80s to see the churches, to see our famous leaders, Frank Chikane and Beyers Naudé, Archbishop Tutu, so many others playing a leadership role in society was very, very inspiring. And I carry that with me. I've always had a passion for South African politics because, like all of us in this call, I'm a passionate South African. I love this country and its people. And I feel very privileged to be able to make a small contribution at the tail end of my working life.
And let's talk about your passion for education, Prof, because we're already here. You mentioned that you were heading the Wits School of Administration, I believe it was called at the time, before you were Wits Business School, before you were given the task of starting the Gordon Institute of Business Science from the ground up. Talk us through, I guess, that journey, the journey of educating and training people who go on to become business leaders, people who go on to become some of the most prominent entrepreneurs. And in that, also then take us through the experience of starting something like Gibbs from the ground up. But I think, and I know I'm asking you a lot of questions, what I want to know with regards to the Gibbs story in particular is, what is the question that you were hoping Gibbs would answer? Because we had already had business schools, right? But you decided to start the Gordon Institute. And so from that experience of teaching, from that experience of training, up until the point of deciding to go on that path of founding the school, what is the question in the country at the time or in business in the country at the time that you were hoping that Gibbs would answer?
It's a fantastic question, because let me just backtrack a little bit. So I had a career in business for quite a few years and then ran a company. So I learned practically what it takes to run an organization and be responsible for the overall performance of any organization. And so I did that. Then I went to do my doctorate, and then I came back. And the passion that drove me to go to the Wits Business School, but also to start Gibbs, was very simply that I knew people like me needed as much help as possible to do the kind of work that executives who are leaders, not managers, who are leaders, have to learn. In this world we live, if you think about any organization, including RISE, you and I are completely dependent on the quality of the institutions, from the ECD to the high school, to the bank, to the hospital, to Google, to anything. We're in the hands of institutions. And if they run well, the country makes progress. If they run badly, it doesn't. It's the same as a government. A government either creates value or destroys value. Good governments create value for people. Bad governments don't. So I was completely passionate about that. And secondly, it was the dawn of the 21st century. So you may or may not remember a thing called Y2K. And the whole world might crash because we were turning the digital clock. And so all of these things were on the agenda as we started Gibbs, with a fantastic team and a lot of freedom from the University of Pretoria. And I had one simple brief from the Vice Chancellor: build a world-class business school. And that's what we set out to do. But I've always carried with me the challenge of managing and leading. I have so much respect for those who do this. It's a kind of I don't know how to put it. It's a critical role when you're in the apex of a team, to change it, to lead it, to set the standards, set an example, to innovate, to learn and unlearn, is the role that leaders play in modern life. And South Africa, has amazing businesses, but we don't have any growth. And we maybe will come back to the vitality of the economy, because it's the economy that creates jobs. The government doesn't create jobs. So it was a wonderful period in which to start from scratch. Literally on a sheet of paper, I wrote a few points down, and I had enormous freedom, and we got the funding, and off we went. A lot of what we did, I didn't imagine we would do. It sort of came along. But most of the things we did worked, and the school grew very, very quickly, and is now one of the leading schools in the country. It's probably the largest face-to-face teaching school in South Africa. So South Africa's been blessed with business schools for 50, 60 years, actually. And many companies use them, and many individuals come and study there. The third thing I want to say about Gibbs was that I also had, though, because of my history, a view that it should play a developmental role. That meant it should work with young kids. So we have a grade 11s program for 200 grade 11 kids from all public schools in Cape Town and in Joburg. And we run other leadership programs that have nothing to do with business education. They have to do with leadership. And I've always believed with people with high potential, you just have to show them a room with a view. Once they see the view, they respond. You don't have to teach them much. Once they've got the idea that this is possible in their lives, they take it up. And that program called the Spirit of Youth is one I'm very, very proud of. But we've run programs for government, for state-owned enterprises, for NGOs. We send executives to 20 countries a year. Because one of the things that really scares me or worries me about South Africa is we're very isolated. We're very inward looking. We look at our past and we look internally. The world is changing so quickly, and it doesn't need our permission to change. And we're very absorbed in our own story here. And when I go to Asia, I see the open-mindedness of these countries to say, bring it on, come, let's compete. And South Africa, I'm not sure, always gets that message. We've got to compete against the best in the world at whatever we do, whether it's how we do our politics, whether it's how we run the government, how we run our companies, how we conduct ourselves personally. And I always say leaders need a map and a mirror. The mirror is why you're in the room, and the map is where are you and where you're trying to get to. And the map, you put useful information about your journey, and all of us have the ability to do that. And the mirror is why are you doing what you're doing. And the thing about South Africa that I just so enjoy is it's so challenging. You know, I often don't sleep much at night because I'm so compelled to put up my hand along with amazing people in RISE and to try and make a small difference. It's a very challenging country that could do much better than it is. Much better than it is. And I think in that sense, a generation of leaders have let us down.
Sure. You've said a lot of important things there, Prof. But I think what I want us to focus on for now is you mentioned the importance of good leadership. You even made the comparison between leadership and management. But you also talked about the importance of well-run institutions, and well-run institutions, whether that's in the public or the private sector, as enablers for growth. So I want us to talk about, because you obviously have an academic business background, but now you're in politics. Is there fundamentally a difference between good leadership in business and in politics? And why do the two need to coexist in order for us to kind of meet all of the development goals and aspirations that we have, but also for us to have an economy that has vitality, like you mentioned?
Well, you know, I mean, you're asking me wonderful questions about which I've tried to think, and I hope my answer will help us all a little bit. Is if you look at any country, and I've been to many and tried to study them, there are three parts to any country. There's the state and politics, there's the economy and business, and then there's civil society. And those three parts have to coexist with each other. If they coexist in a creative way where they trust each other, they can each do different things, because they do different things, and be productive. Where one becomes dominant or not very innovative, it slows the whole system down. What I've learned by going to countries like us, I just spent 2 days in Malawi. I got back yesterday. And you know, once again, it showed me that politics drives economics, and good politics makes good economics, and bad politics makes bad economics. And so the relationship between them is a tension always, because what the market wants to do is different than what the state should do to serve people. In great countries, there's an understanding between them. And when you get that contract between them, it's a social contract of trust and respect. Then each have to do their thing, but they have to do it productively. The Prime Minister of Singapore once said to me that the problem in South Africa is this wheel of the politics and the government is not connected by an axle to this wheel of the economy and business. Whereas in Singapore, he was from Singapore, he said the axle has to make sure both can work together. Now, you know, I'm not a Singaporean, and I'm not a fan of Singapore's democracy, but the idea, and even in some European countries, that the two are in the same canoe. They need each other. They absolutely need each other. Is a fundamental idea that I passionately believe in. And the question is, can both partner and innovate? In this country, we've almost wrecked the state-owned enterprises, the big Escoms and Transnets and SAAs, and there's 700 of them, by the way. And we've failed to make them work properly, productively. And I think one of the huge problems in South Africa is the disconnection between the elites and the people of South Africa. You know, in government, we use the word public service. It means to serve the public, not each other. And so, I'm a Democrat. I'll never be anything else but a Democrat. But the job in a democracy is to make sure there's a connection between the leadership and people. In this country, it's a very flawed relationship. It's a very uneasy relationship, and it's not always a productive relationship. Government doesn't seem to listen to people's needs. If you just take public education as an example, we have one of the worst high school and primary school public education systems in the world. The last ranking I saw said Malawi's education system is better than ours. Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. How did this happen? How could our public institutions provide an education? And the minister gets very excited at the pass rate. The pass rate of what? This is not a competitive education. I went to the Philippines to study their public education system. There you see these kids work really hard with the technology. All their schools, all their primary schools have internet in the classroom. We don't. 80% of our schools do not have internet in the classroom. But our next generation are going to have to compete with them. And that really does worry me.
Yeah. And what else would you say needs to change urgently and fundamentally about our education system if we want to be a competitive global player? We hear a lot about digitization and the introduction of things like coding and robotics to a select few schools in the country. But I wonder if that is enough to allow for South Africans or the South African public schooling system to truly catch up with where the world is. But it's also a very difficult conversation to have when you acknowledge the fact that we're still not getting the basics right. We're still not getting literacy right. We're still not getting basic.
Like most things in South Africa, it's a paradox. We've got some of the best schools in the world, both public and private. But it goes at a very small top into a very large base. So I go to township schools, rural schools, and I see the facilities, and I just think, well, how on earth are we going to produce the kind of citizens, the kind of employees or employers, entrepreneurs that this country needs? How do we lift a generation up? The government can't do this. Our government, the ANC as a government, as a governing party, I never call them a ruling party. I don't like the word ruling. I don't want to be ruled by anybody. But as the governing party has failed to keep the government itself modern, it has failed to leverage in its public duty the state-owned enterprises. And you just have to look at the conditions in our towns, our small towns, let alone our cities. I've been during COVID, I drove a lot. I had a special permit because I was delivering food. And I drove 6 times around this country. I've been to almost, you won't find a small town I've not been to. And in every town, I went into town and drove in a wider circle to see the conditions people are living under. Towns are broken. Go to Welkom. Go to Butterworth. And you will see that Iduchwa, these towns are not functional. The streets are broken. The traffic lights don't work. There are potholes. This is our infrastructure. This is the basic infrastructure that individuals need to live a productive life. So these are all the complaints. How do we fix this? Is we elect the right leaders who are competent. They're not party deployees. They're ethical. They are professionally qualified. They are hardworking, and they are competent. And we send, one thing I do believe, and people may not all agree with this, I believe politics is the highest form of leadership. And I can say that because I'm not standing for any public office. But I do. I deeply believe that. What I've learned, you were asking about the difference in business and politics. This is much tougher. In a business, you can count how much money you took and what profits you made. In politics, you can go to sleep in one place and wake up in another. It's so dynamic. It's so virtual. It's so abstract. It's about ideology and policy. It's a completely different game. It's a completely different thing. And I've always respected politics, but I've come to understand it better in the last 18 months working with RISE, is that it's a profound form of leadership. It is the highest form of leadership, is to serve your nation and the people. In business, you're serving the shareholders. In the public service, you're serving the ministry. In state-owned enterprises, you're serving the organization. But political leadership is the highest form of leadership. And I think China, as much as I might have ideological differences with China, China has shown us that with great leadership, they've been able to completely transform their country in the space of 40 years. What can we learn from that? My motto is learn from everyone and copy no one. Figure out your own answers to your own problems, but be aware of what's happening around the world. And China, what a story China is for all of us to live. So we've got to reform the state. We have to step back from the state and say highly paid state employees are not always, there are many good employees, of course, are not always delivering what they're meant to, especially at the municipal level. A politician once said, all politics is from your gate to your front door, because that's your water, your electricity, your garbage collection. It's the basics. And we have, as I drive around this country, I'm sure we'd all agree, we're not getting those basics right. We need to hold people to account. The middle class has such a big job to play, to hold elites to account and to demand that they do the right thing. The fact that we can't run our metro rail in eThekwini, in Cape Town, and Joburg is a disgrace. The fact that our roads are full of trucks because we can't operate Transnet, although it is now improving, I'm happy to say, that we have allowed Transnet to almost destroy the mining industry. You may have seen over the weekend, if you're following business, that an Australian company is wanting to buy Anglo American. It was our biggest company by far, and the deal may or may not go through. But we've lost in mining. We were the best in the world at mining. Now, there are lots of problems in mining, but we were the best. Surely you want to perform the best and make it better rather than finding yourself unable to compete.
Sure. Thanks for that, Prof. And I think also highlighting the importance of good leadership at a local level. Because that's where service delivery begins. And I think it was our premier candidate in Gauteng who said this during her debate this week, a political party debate, that it's important that we invest in the people who lead our municipalities. It's important that we pay them well, so that we're making sure that we are attracting the very best talent to lead municipalities, because rebuilding our country really starts at local government before anything else. Before I go on and ask you
can I just say something about that?
Yes,
so
please.
Can you point me to a municipal manager's program where I learned to be a municipal manager? Could you point me to a councillor's program in cities or towns or provincial MLCs? You can't. So we haven't thought about this in a very structured way. If you go to China, there's a system of producing government officials at all the levels. If you go to France, it's the same thing. And we just haven't done it. So what happens is community leaders who have the voice of the people and the best interests at heart. Have you ever studied a municipal budget? I work with the Auditor General from time to time. And you see how badly our municipalities are doing. Well, people are not properly trained. So water is a big crisis all over the country, but we don't have water engineers in these towns. I mean, this is just a fundamental challenge to get right. And what I love about RISE, what I really love about RISE is a new generation of people who are going to pick up this challenge, and we're going to be involved in governance. We're not going to govern. We're going to be involved in governance for the next 5 years of holding that level of leadership you're referring to account.
And we'll no problem. We're here to get to know you, Prof. And I think there's a lot to be said about holding people accountable. Once again, I think it's one of those things that we say quite a lot as a buzz phrase, so to speak. But what does that look like practically in South Africa?
Well, one of the things I love about RISE's manifesto is we have as a policy that 75% of all MPs must be based in a constituency, which means that I will know who my MP is, my member of parliament. That's not how it works now. How it works now, especially in the ANC and other big parties, the EFF and the DA, is that it's a scramble to be on the list. And you curry favor with the senior leaders in order to get high on the list so you can get into office. That's not how it should be. The community should say, this is the person we want to represent us in the highest structure of the land, in our parliament. And that person comes from us. And that's why I love constituency-based elections. Let the people choose to who they want to send. That's how it works in America. That's how it works in China. That's how it works in Japan. That's how it works in Britain.
And in response to that, Peter Willis says he loves what you said, that we don't have to be in government to get closely involved in governance. Before we continue, Prof, I do want to but rather read out some of the comments that we've been receiving. If you've just joined us, welcome to Fireside Chat. My name is Dimpho Lekgeu, and we are in conversation with Prof. Nick Binedell, who is the Business Sector Coordinator at RISE Mzansi. There's a comment here from Peter Willis again, who says, really enjoying Prof's observation that economy, state, and civil society need to understand and respect each other's role for a society to thrive, even to function. Itumeleng Monametsi says there's an entire generation of about 800,000 young people born between 2005 and 2003 who do not make it into school or to grade 12. What other political interventions will be able to realistically and practically implement to ensure that these people grow into employable adults? So that's our first question. And then another question from Zolani Zonyane, who says, it's widely known and reported that South Africa has a leadership deficit. What urgent steps are required to build these visionary leaders to close the existing gap?
Lovely, great questions. So let me start with the second question first, which is the people in RISE are those kinds of leaders from what I've seen. The people who volunteered, the people who are working with us, the people in the National Leadership Collective, they are the kinds of people that we need in our system. People who will have a profession, but they're willing to serve their society. People who are right for the time they're in. And people who care for the most excluded. It's heartbreaking to drive through parts of this country and see the poverty. I've been campaigning in the Cape Flats in places like Manenberg and Philippi. I mean, it's heartbreaking to go into shacks where the gap between the shacks, I have to turn sideways to walk between them. It's just inhuman. And people, it's so hard to come out of that with a normal map of the world. Where we were campaigning on Wednesday, the woman who we went to see said, every night you hear the gunshots here. You can't go out at night. All the grannies said to us, well, you can't go out at night. You have to get all your business done while there's daylight. Nobody leaves their house at night. This is large parts of Cape Town. So that to me, just remind me the first comment again, if you wouldn't mind. I'm sorry.
No problem. So it's from Itumeleng Monametsi, who speaks about the 800,000 young people who did not make it through school. So the rate of dropouts. What are the political interventions that we're able to implement to ensure that these people become empowered and employable?
You see, I think, I love studying history. So if you study Europe after the Second World War, there were 200 million people in Europe. 60 million when the war ended were in the wrong country. In other words, they weren't in the country, they'd been displaced. And the world, including Europe, but including the Americans, funded the rehabilitation of these people and these governments. And they rebuilt themselves over 40 years. And so they treated it as an emergency, as a crisis. Somebody much cleverer than me once said, you can't keep on doing the right thing and expect a different result. So I would say for those 800,000 people, as supportive as I am of the Public Works program, I would say we need to set about a second chance for people who drop out of high school. We've got to create a stream for people. Japan did it, Germany did it. You've got to find a way to absorb them into the economy and give them a useful skill. Apart from just their dignity, is they've got to have a skill. India does this absolutely brilliantly. You know, I travel around India in small towns. Every small town has an institute for technology where people learn to code. And you can see early in the morning, people queuing up at 6:30 or 7 in the morning. It's cold. They're waiting to go in, and they do 3 months of coding, and then they're a coder. Then they apply to a big company. They get trained for another year, and suddenly they're flying off. I was sitting in a plane in Amsterdam, waiting to land in Amsterdam, surrounded by Indian software engineers. These are people who'd come from poor backgrounds, who are now highly trained software engineers working on Dutch companies. I mean, you can do this. So those 800,000 do need another chance. I'm not sure they should stay in the same system. Maybe there's a different kind of system that we should develop, because they have life experience. If you drop out of grade 10 or grade 9 and you hang around for 4 or 5 years, you need a different kind of experience to get all of that to work. And so I'm very much in favor of some kind of program. We've not really discussed it, but it's not that hard to do. And we can't have another lost, you know, when I was much younger, we talked about the lost generation. Your parents were the lost generation. We can't do this again, not with our freedoms, not with democracy in South Africa. So I don't know how expensive this is to do. I'm sure it is expensive, but we've got to give them a second chance. If you look at how we closed nursing schools and teachers training colleges, within 15 years, we'd shut most of them under the ANC leadership because everyone said they must go to university. Well, I've spent my whole life in universities. University is a wonderful place to go. But actually, many people need a vocation. They need a technical skill to start. And we've looked down our noses at that. We said that's second-hand university. It's not. Go to India, where the software engineers are, and you'll see what they do. And then all the practical vocational. You know, a plumber gets employed. Someone who drops out of high school who doesn't have any skill does not get employed. I think those kinds of programs have to be developed over time. And let me say one last thing, if I may. I do think we're in a crisis. The problem we've got, it's a slow crisis. So the middle class especially are uncomfortable, but they're not in a crisis. Well, they should be. When this economy doesn't grow, when no new jobs are created year after year after year, we are heading for a crisis. And if you want to understand that, just go to our neighbor and see what happened there over 20 years. You know, if you made a video of the last 15 years or 10 years of South Africa and you condense it into 30 seconds, it would be a building falling down. We are in a crisis. It just doesn't affect us every day. And especially if you're in the middle class, you sort of hope the traffic light will go away. They're not going away. They are increasing in number. There are families. There are brothers and sisters. They are fellow South Africans with the same right to dignity and the ability to earn. I'm not a socialist in the sense we must all just support them all the time, but I certainly am a social democrat where they must be given a chance. But we must understand the truth of South Africa. The truth of is the government's not functioning properly. And because of that, business is not investing. And because business is not investing, the economy is not growing. When the economy doesn't grow, we can't tax the economy, the business anymore. So we can't tax people anymore. So we've borrowed as much money as we can. So if you think of the government like owning a credit card, it's maxed out the credit card. I think the interest repayments now are 30% of the budget. So it's like your monthly household budget, you're spending 30% just on the debt on your credit card. That's not a sustainable system. We don't have more money. We've got to get smarter, more efficient. And I'll say one more thing. We've got to work harder. When I go to Asia, people don't work 8-hour days. They work 10 and 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They work very, very hard. Now, many South Africans do work hard, but many people, even in big companies, they don't. I was working with a state-owned enterprise a couple of years ago. I was shocked to see what the productivity rate is. I would say people there were working half the time. That's terrifying because it's one of the big infrastructure providers. And as I said earlier, if that infrastructure doesn't work, then you and I can't have a productive life.
Sure.
Our work ethic, we privileged ones who have seen the world and been educated and are going to put our shoulder to the wheel. We've got to work like Japanese did after the war, like South Koreans did after the war. That generation of people in South Korea. Let me give you a number. In 1957, when Ghana became independent, Ghanaians earned 3 times as much as South Koreans. Today, South Koreans earn 20 times more than Ghanaians. The problem is the Ghanaians never went to South Korea, so they didn't see what was possible. That's a tragedy. And that's hard work. It's a hard work ethic. And I don't know what else to say about it, other than I don't know how one gets people to be productive as a society. We were very productive in the struggle. People worked their hearts out. They risked their lives to make South Africa a democracy. Now let's make the economy grow. And we've got a lot to say about big companies and how they treat us. I agree with most of that comment. But these are, we're very lucky to have these big companies. There's no other country in Africa that has the multinationals and the domestic companies that South Africa has. No other country. There's no other Santon in this continent. And because, it's 1 billion people, we have the crown jewel. We have the crown jewel. So we should know what we've got. We are very fortunate to have highly sophisticated banks, insurance companies, fast food companies. We're very fortunate. Now we must make them more accessible, and we need new entrepreneurs. And hopefully your generation will make that happen.
New entrepreneurs and new leaders. I want to circle back to something you mentioned, which was going to be one of my later questions. The fact that South Africa is in a crisis, but you describe it as a slow crisis. I think just to put everyone at ease and to not make everyone fearful, what is it that we can do? What is it that we are responsible for now as South Africans to help the process of that crisis rolling out?
Sometimes people do say to me that you're raising scary issues, you're making us fearful. And I always laugh, and I always say, did you work harder for exams? When exams were coming, did you work harder? And everyone says yes. I certainly waited till exams were coming, and then I really worked hard to pass. We need to set exams. We need to set them for ourselves individually. We need to do it in our organizations. We need to do it in our communities. Let's set high standards for ourselves. So I deeply believe that leadership comes from individuals who confront reality, as Songezo has done. When I met Songezo for an innocent cup of coffee 2 years ago, he invited me for a cup of coffee, and then he told me for 20 minutes about RISE, and I said, I'm in. But what he said to me that triggered me was that I'm going to do something about this. And I was captured by that, because he is that kind of leader. He sets the personal standard at a very high level. And he's a remarkable South African. I've been so privileged to meet many remarkable South Africans. I say this at risk. Amongst our generation, this generation, he is one of the most remarkable people I know. He has humility, he has intellect, he has passion, he has fire in his belly. He's really smart. He gets the story. And when it comes to the Eastern Cape, it's in him. And I deeply respect him for that. So we have the right leaders. Everyone just has to do a bit more.
Can you teach that, Prof? And I'm really sorry to interrupt you. But earlier we spoke about the need to have more institutions and programs that train leaders who are going to lead not just in governments, but also people who are going to become political leaders, right? And we spoke about training business executives, for example, so that they're able to lead organizations and build resilient institutions and not just manage. But all of these qualities that you mentioned, the passion, the fire, the self-belief, this idea that I need to do something about the situation in my country, is that a quality of leadership that you can teach?
Absolutely. That's where it all starts. Read Steve Biko. Read Mandela's history. Study Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo. These people were truly remarkable. In your generation, it'll be women are going to play a dominant leadership role, I suspect. So look at Adelaide. Look at Mrs. Sisulu, Albertina Sisulu. She was a remarkable person. So let's fire up this next generation. But you start by looking in the mirror and say, why am I in the room? What have I come to do in this life? And, it's not hard to answer that question. You don't have to change the world. You just have to deal with something in front of you, something around you. Start small. The journey, Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, explains it. You just start making one step, which leads to another. My friends thought I was nuts when I joined the UDF. They all thought I'd become a communist. I said, you don't know the difference between a communist and a Democrat. I've become a Democrat. And now many of my friends go, you're doing what at your age? You're going into an unknown party? I said, absolutely. What a privilege to have another go at trying to make a small difference. That's what that's South Africans asking us to do something. That knock on the door is ordinary people. I see them every day. In Spa, in Checkers, I see them every day. I see too many of the traffic lights and not enough in jobs. Our job is to encourage them, to give them hope, to give them skills. Each one, teach one was Kasatu's slogan in the 80s. I remember it so well. Each one, teach one. What would happen if everyone in this call, I don't know how many people are listening to this, but whoever's in this call went tomorrow and said, who can I lift? Who can I just help a little bit? Not help totally. They've got to lift themselves. But each one, teach one. That's what we should be doing. In my study and travels around the world, I've seen these countries that do this in spite of the government. In spite of the government. We are going to take charge of our own future as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a religious group. It doesn't matter. Just take charge. Take charge of your own destiny. And I mentioned Steve Biko because I was so inspired by him. I was so inspired by Black consciousness and his intellectual determination to crystallize his thinking. Now, I was on the other side. I believed in what the ANC believed is more of a non-racial society, but he just was exceptional. We don't have to sacrifice our lives. We just have to do the work. Because all the potential is there. We've got all the institutions. We've got all the infrastructure. We've got all the natural resources. We've got this incredibly beautiful, I see the number of tourists. They're just coming, they're flocking to South Africa. They don't go to Joburg that much because it's got a difficult reputation. But here in Cape Town, where I am, it's incredible. This is an amazing country. I go to the Drakensberg. I go to the Eastern Highlands in Mpumalanga. There are very few countries as beautiful as this. When I fly up to Jozi and back, I'm always got 2 or 3 foreigners next to me, ask them why they've come. They say this is such an interesting country and the people are so remarkable here. We are coming back. That's what.
I don't know the numbers, but I would say that tourists are still visiting Joburg. We were in Soweto yesterday to commemorate Freedom Day. And as we walked through the different streets led by our National Leadership Collective and Seth Mazibuko, we actually came across quite a few tourists. And obviously visiting Soweto means that they're not just interested in visiting South Africa, but in getting to know our political history and what makes us our story. But I think you articulated so well when you spoke about each one, teach one, and just that sense of responsibility and duty towards our communities and our country, which speaks to one of RISE Mzansi's organizing values or principles of ownership. Taking ownership of the work that we do, taking ownership of our communities, taking ownership of each other, right? As we try to decide for ourselves the kind of South Africa that we want to live in. We have a few more questions that have come in. So I'm going to pause yet again and go to the comment section. I think we have a question and a couple of comments. So I'm going to start with the comments. Luxie Bills on Facebook. I hope I'm saying this correctly. I agree. Vocational skills must be brought back at a high school level. Rural and township schools are affected the most, forcing all children through mainstream education, yet a lot of them need to be redirected to vocational technical schools that are non-existent in these particular communities. The Department of Education needs to repurpose those closed schools to address this issue. She also says, RISE Mzansi is about ordinary citizens who are no longer willing to sit by the sidelines and watch this country fall off the cliff. The political arena must be infiltrated by those professionals and community leaders who are hands-on and want to turn things around. Thank you for that, Luxie. And then Peter Willis asks, every party promises to create jobs. How is it possible to do that at scale in South Africa in the next 5 years? Is it possible at all?
It's a great question. I mean, the answer, truthfully, in my personal view, I don't know if everyone in RISE would share this with me, but that's not going to happen very quickly, sadly. What we've got to do is fix government. We have to improve the education system. We have to fix the infrastructure, and that will attract investment. And the investment creates the jobs. As I said earlier, government doesn't create jobs. It's investors who create jobs. So this is going to be, we say in RISE, right, 1 generation. It's going to take 1 generation of work to get this right. So there's no instant job creation program. We've got social grants, and maybe we can increase them a bit. But, apart from just people surviving, having enough food, I mean, I meet people without enough food. How can you not have enough food in this country? It's crazy. But so social grants I'm in support of. But you can't support we support 20 odd million people with social grants. You can't have an economy where 20 million, that's 1/3, every third person is living on a social grant. People have to become productive. And so how do we help them? Create their own jobs, work for others, build our small business. In Malawi, what I noticed is driving through the many towns I drove through is how many small businesses there are in the towns. The small towns are full of small businesses, as it is in the Philippines. So you just got to start up somehow, selling food, repairing shoes, fixing bicycles, whatever it is. And sadly in South Africa, so many young people are unable to work or already don't have that drive and confidence to go and make something happen. We can't afford to give an income to the unemployed population, which is huge, and give them a decent lifestyle. It's not possible mathematically. So it's going to take time. And what I love about RISE is not promising instant solutions to these things. We are saying this is going to take time. We must turn it around through good governance.
Sure. Now, I've tried throughout the conversation to steer you away from talking about RISE, but somehow you keep bringing it up and talking about your love for RISE and just your belief in RISE as a vehicle that's going to usher in this new standard of political leaders, this new standard for people who work in public office. So let's talk about it, Prof. You mentioned that cup of coffee with our national leader, Songezo, 2 years ago, and that you put your hand up and you said, absolutely, I want to be a part of this new thing. Let's get it going. Talk to me about your journey into RISE Mzansi, because your journey has been quite interesting. You mentioned that business, civil society, and politics are the 3 pillars that kind of have to work together to make a country work, and you've done all of them. And so how was that journey and that transition from going into something that you had been doing for years, which is education and building businesses, and now being the business sector coordinator for RISE?
So, I wish I'd done more, actually. The last 18 months have gone as though it was 24 hours. It's been so quick. And the challenge of starting with a sheet of paper and building an organization and raising the funds and attracting the people has been an extraordinary achievement that people in RISE Mzansi can be proud of. And it's taken a huge effort from them. And I've been a small part of that. I found the people in RISE to be so inspiring. Vuiso Ramakgopa, our chair, Tebogo Moalusi, who's our Gauteng organizer, in eThekwini, in the Eastern Cape, here in Axe, who's the Premier candidate in the Western Cape. These are fantastic people. They're people I'd work in any enterprise with, in doing anything. And we've been lucky to attract that quality of people. It started just with a few people. It came out of the Rivonia Circle, as you know, which was a think tank. And then Songezo made the decision. I don't know who he asked, but he very early said to me, would I come and lend a hand? And I said, yes. And I've been through this remarkable journey since then. There's something about the spirit of RISE that I just am so attracted to. It reminds me of the 80s, where it was so risky. I was explaining earlier how dangerous it was. Well, it's not dangerous in that way, or much. Occasionally it is. But it's so uncertain. We don't know how we're going to do. We just know we've worked hard. We're going to keep working hard, embracing those who will work with us, mobilizing people to vote for us, and hope that people have trust in the values of RISE. RISE is a values-driven organization. It may have challenges, of course it does, any organization does, but I've been inspired by the integrity of the people I've been privileged to work with.
And I know earlier on you spoke about kind of sharing with your circle that you are going into this new political party in South Africa during a very interesting time in our political landscape, and their action was almost, why are you doing that at your age? But let's talk about how people have received you in the business sector, right? Would you say that people who are in business in South Africa today understand the responsibility that business has to play in rebuilding our country, and in also influencing the right kind of politics and influencing the business circle to choose the right kind of political leaders?
I think, you're asking me such fantastic questions. So it's not simple. So before I came to RISE, I was working in a big domestic investment program with government, with the president and the cabinet, and with other people trying to get domestic investment going. And it was extremely difficult because of the bureaucracy. But I watched businesses' effort, and I watched how the business community responded at the back end of the Zuma administration. And it came to the party and it spoke out. And it marched, which was amazing for me to see. It's partnering with government to try and fix Transnet, try and fix Eskom, try and fix security, try and get the logistics working, and it's doing so constructively. The fundamental problem is this, to put it very simply. If you're a big bank in South Africa, your value depends on the country. The value of your bank depends on the value of the country, but we don't teach that. People think that Standard Bank has got to beat ABSA and ABSA has got to beat Standard Bank, but actually they're both dependent on having a viable country and an economy. So there are many captains of industry in the 80s too who took a risk. They were criticized by their colleagues. I can remember it very clearly. They were seen as being crazy and why are you joining these organizations? But they were right. They had the moral purpose. And I think there are many that do have that now. Corporate South Africa is playing a constructive role. It could do more. So BLSA is led by Busi, and she's doing a great job. There's a voice of business pushing government to deliver more and to partner with government to create more. But essentially, business cannot be too political. It shouldn't be too political. It should be interested in the commonwealth, in the public interest. It should advocate for the public interest, but it should not be sectarian. It should be broad in its approach. And I think in the last few years, I think we can say that has happened.
Sure.
We need more, but it has happened. And I commend the business leaders for speaking out. Just today, I was reading one of the CEOs of a big mining company criticizing government to say, in the mining industry, investment is not happening because the infrastructure is not working. Now, to speak out publicly like that is very, very important. And I commend the business leaders who do that.
Sure. And I think that goes back to accountability, what we spoke about, but also ownership, and recognizing that nothing works if the country does not work. and so that we all have a responsibility in our different spheres of influence to speak up about these issues, but to also constantly speak about the kind of country that we envision for ourselves and what it's going to take to get there. We have more comments. And there was one in particular about business support. I think it was from Katlego, who says, most South Africans want to start businesses. However, they don't have support from government in terms of infrastructure, skills, and capital. And he wasn't necessarily asking a question, but I just want to ask, there's this narrative, and I'm not sure if it's a fact, you will correct me if I'm wrong, Prof, that South Africans start businesses out of necessity. That South Africans start businesses to survive. And so a lot of them do not envision some kind of long-term sustainability for their businesses. They're just starting businesses to survive. How do we get to a point where we have small enterprises that entrepreneurs are starting that are actually going to last?
Well, I think
from government to ensure that there's infrastructure skills and capital.
The guy who started Nando's, Robbie Brosen, is a friend of mine. Robbie Brosen was sent to do a chartered accounting degree at Wits, and he was bored. So he went to Rosettenville to eat some chicken south of Joburg. He loved the chicken. It was spicy. The guy who owned the shop was called Fernando. He went back to his father. He said, I'm going to stop studying. Can we buy this little business? Today, that's called Nando's. So you don't really start out. Starting with survival is a very good place to start because it teaches you hardship, teaches you how tough it is to start a business. I've known many entrepreneurs who started with nothing. So yeah, my view, I'm a fighter. I always have been. You know, a lot of corporate people said there's no need for another business school. We have enough. And I said, no, I'm going to show you there's a need for a different business school. And Gibbs became that school. So I think the tenacity to survive is actually a key ingredient. And then if it starts to work, if you've had a good idea and it begins to work, then maybe you build a vision. But you start with, can I sell some chickens? Which is how he started. Nando's is in the top 100 consumer goods brands in the world. And when Obama spoke in South Africa, he said, we know South Africa in the White House. My daughters eat at Nando's. I mean, what an achievement in 30 years. Sure. Discovery. I look at Investec, discovery. We need a new generation of people who don't look like me, who are going to come along and start with very little and make their way up to build great, great business enterprise. Look at Dangote in Nigeria. I mean, he started with cement and he built a huge, huge enterprise. We need the toughness. So I like survival. You know, a friend of mine once said to me, just because you've discovered you're paranoid does not mean they're not going to get you. Be paranoid. Only the paranoid survive. I love that. Every day at Gibbs in the first 5 years, I thought, are we going to make it this month? I love that energy. It's like the rugby and the soccer. You don't know if you're going to win, but if you don't fight, you know you're going to lose. So I'm sorry to go on about it, but the survival instinct for me is number one. I am determined. I look at people I've lectured at Gibbs of all colors and gender and whatever it is. The people who've got their eyes open and who are energized, they're the ones who are going to write their will into the world. They'll be unstoppable.
Okay,
I admire survivors.
Sure. Don't be afraid to take on the challenge of entrepreneurship.
Don't be naive. Be damn smart. Don't be naive. No one's going to look after you. Look after yourself, and then take people along.
Sure.
I started Gibbs with one sheet of paper with 5 points written down by pen, and 18 months later we opened. Start small. You don't. There's a great quote a guy said to me once: "Stars don't need permission to shine. Stars just shine.
They just do.
They just get on with it."
Sure. And speaking about stars shining, Prof, because while stars just shine, I think an important element to that question was around the support that entrepreneurs need to receive from our government. So I want you to briefly touch on that. The kind of capital support, infrastructure support, what does that look like? And is it adequate where we are in our country at the moment?
I hope I don't disappoint you. We've got IDCs and PICs and development banks. We've got all these funding organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many people say, oh, but they don't give us money. Well, maybe they know that your idea is not a good one. Or maybe they're not very smart and they don't understand how good it is. But every entrepreneur I've talked to, when I met the Prime Minister of Singapore, he said at the first cabinet meeting in Singapore, they walked into the room and the Prime Minister said, we'll never borrow money from anybody. Because if we borrow money, we're not free. And Singapore has never borrowed $1. Not one. Many of the entrepreneurs I know started with nothing. Raymond Ackerman built Pick n Pay. He had nothing. His father's business failed. Start with nothing. Get hungry. Build Apple. So government should do more. It's got a very badly run small business enterprise ministry, but it's very underfunded. So if you can get funding through the IDC or the DBSA, that's fine, but don't start there. It makes dependency.
Thanks for that, Prof. I hope Katlego is answered. But before because we're about to wrap up our conversation,
Sure.
And I want us to wrap up by talking about your travels. You touch on that quite a bit, and I can tell that you enjoy the thrill of traveling and getting to know different people and different cultures. But because we're trying to get to know you at the same time, I want to know, when you are traveling, what do you miss the most about South Africa?
I don't know what I miss the most, but I can tell you I love coming back. I love coming home and going through immigration and going into Joburg, that vibrant city, and saying I'm home, because there's only one home. I go everywhere, but there's only one home. And I'm inspired by all the countries I visit. My motto is learn from everyone and copy no one. So I go to many of these countries in South America, Southeast Asia. I'm very privileged to be able to do it. I must tell you, I stay in the cheapest hotels and I fly economy always because I can travel more that way. But I have learned so much from traveling. And what it did, I mentioned at the beginning that I lived in 6 countries by the time I was 10. So I had a comparative eye, always comparing this to that. I travel a lot still, and I'm privileged to do that. But I'm always comparing. Malawi inspired me. It's one of the poorest countries in the world with the most amazing people. And they're going through a really hard time. They inspired me to say, if they just hang in and keep working, it may come right. In Southeast Asia, there's 600 million people, all of them hardworking. All of them. Some have corrupt governments, some have democratic governments, some have military dictatorships. I love traveling because it allows me to compare. What I always say when I'm lecturing is, if you only know A, you don't know A. You only discover what A is when you meet B.
Sure.
B defines A. So if you only know one country or one industry or one company, you don't know what that company is. It's only when you meet others that you begin to compare. Isn't that the journey of life? And I think I do acknowledge I've been incredibly privileged to travel, but let me tell you, I've worked damn hard to have the privilege. And that privilege has always inspired me. I get on a plane. I once went to India for dinner and came back the next day just to go. So I spend a lot of my time sitting in airplanes, but I do it because I learn. I learn by reading and studying and teaching and talking to South Africans, but I learn a lot from talking to people from other countries. and hearing this. Dimpho, thanks so much for all your amazing questions.
You're welcome. I had one last one, but now that you said thank you, I can't ask it. It's clearly the end of the conversation, so it's fine. I'll wrap up also because we've run out of time. And thank you, Prof. Nick, for being an excellent guest. Thank you for being open with us and sharing with us about your history and the role that you played, not just in South Africa's education and business industries, but also your work in the UDF as part of the work to build a democratic South Africa. There have been a lot of comments in the comment section about what a fun interview this has been and how everyone has enjoyed getting to know you better. And we certainly hope to have you back on Fireside Chats as you continue to do the important work of bringing the business community together to rally behind this message of us really needing to usher in a new generation and a new standard of leaders. So thank you so much, Prof. Nick. And
thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who's been watching. You have been an excellent audience as well. Thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you for your questions and for your comments. And we will most certainly see you again next week, Sunday. They usually stay same time, same place on all of our RISE platforms. Good night, and thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.